Why are they starving the Palestinians? Why are they killing the Palestinians? Why are they making Gaza unlivable? It's very simple. They want to drive them out.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Intercontinental. My name is Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director at the Centre for Independent Studies. Now, John Mearsheimer is without doubt one of the most distinguished professors of political science in the world. He's been a professor of political science at the University of Chicago for more than 4 decades. He's the author of many prominent and influential books, most notably The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, that was published in 2001, and Foreign Affairs magazine, the prestigious New York-based Journal of Opinion on International Affairs. It ranks Mearsheimer's Great Power thesis as one of the 3 most influential foreign policy theses of the post-Cold War era. John, as Foreign Affairs has actually acknowledged, is, quote, one of the most famous political scientists in history. Extraordinary rap. One of the most famous political scientists in history. And that review of John's latest book was written by a critic. John is also, I think it's fair to say, a global sensation in the digital world. In fact, 19 of his debates and interviews on YouTube have each attracted more than 1 million views. It's extraordinary, extraordinary. And I should stress that since he quite correctly predicted that the US-led invasion of Iraq would be not just unnecessary, but a strategic blunder of epic proportions. So it's an extraordinary reach and influence for John. And with that, it's my great pleasure, on behalf of CIS, to welcome Professor John Mearsheimer back to CIS.
Thank you very much for the kind words, Tom. It's great to be back here. Great to see Tom again. And thank you all for coming out to hear me speak tonight. As everybody knows, since October 7th, the Middle East has been turned upside down. I think before October 7th, almost everybody thought that the Middle East was a quite stable area. There were no big problems. Then October 7th happened, and it looks like nothing but trouble today and for as far as the eye can see. And what I'd like to do is analyze what has happened since October 7th. I'd like to talk about the causes of the trouble, where we are today, and where we're going. And my basic argument is that Israel is the big loser. Israel is in really serious trouble today, and there's little hope of getting away from that moving forward. Second, that the Americans are also losers, although they do not lose as big as Israel does. And the winners, not in any decisive way, but the winners are the Iranians. For purposes of background, for putting a framework in your head, it's very important to understand that Israel today is what I would call Greater Israel. Israel controls everything between the river and the sea. And that Greater Israel includes what's called Green Line Israel. That was Israel before the 1967 war, plus Gaza, plus the West Bank. Okay, so there are those 3 areas that comprise Greater Israel. And what's very important to understand is that inside Greater Israel, there are roughly 7.3 million Palestinians and roughly 7.3 million Israeli Jews. There is rough equality between the 2 sides. So the question is, how does Israel think about dealing with Greater Israel, where you have rough equality between these 2 populations? And there are basically 4 options. One is you have a democratic Greater Israel. That's not going to happen because it would no longer be a Jewish state. Okay, because if you look at demographic patterns, the Palestinians are making more babies than the Israeli Jews. So that's not happening. Second possibility is a 2-state solution, Everybody loves to talk about a two-state solution. That is not happening, certainly after what happened on October 7th, but even before then, and I'll talk more about this. Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli elite has no interest in a two-state solution, okay? The third possibility is apartheid, and basically what you now have is an apartheid state. We can go into this in detail in the Q&A if you want to do that, but if you look at Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights group in Israel, all three of those organizations have produced lengthy reports that lay out why Israel is an apartheid state. The fourth option is ethnic cleansing. And ethnic cleansing means getting rid of the Palestinians, for the most part, who live in Gaza and who live in the West Bank, and creating a greater Israel that is completely dominated by Israeli Jews and has very few, if any, Palestinians in its midst. So again, the four options are, number one, democratic greater Israel. Number two, two-state solution. Those two are off the table. Number three, apartheid, which is basically what you have now. And number four is ethnic cleansing, where you get rid of the Palestinians. Okay. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about what the situation looked like before October 7th, and focus mainly on Gaza. Before October 7th, the Palestinians in Gaza basically lived in a giant open-air prison. What happened was that in 2005, when Ariel Sharon was the prime minister of Israel, he decided to pull the settlers out of Gaza. As you know, there are settlers in the West Bank. Up until 2005, there were Israeli settlers in Gaza, and Sharon pulled them out. And he pulled them out because Gaza was a hornet's nest, and having settlers in there was a nightmare. And they had their hands full in the West Bank, and they wanted to focus on the West Bank. And what they did was pulled all the settlers out, and it became an open-air prison. Now, it looked up until October 7th like Netanyahu and company were able to manage the situation inside of Gaza. Nobody thought what happened on October 7th was going to happen. This is why the Israelis got caught with their pants down. They thought they were managing the situation very well. And what was going on there is that Netanyahu was actually very happy with the fact that Hamas was running Gaza. This is hard to believe today, but it is true. And he was making sure that Hamas was being funded and that Hamas was doing reasonably well. Now, why is that the case? Because Netanyahu is adamantly opposed to a two-state solution, and Mahmoud Abbas, who runs the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, is in favor of a two-state solution. So from Netanyahu's point of view, Abbas is a threat because Abbas wants a two-state solution. So what Netanyahu has done is supported Hamas, because we all know Hamas does not want a two-state solution, and he's playing off Hamas against the PLO in the West Bank. And it looks like it works. And by the way, every once in a while, every couple of years, the Israelis mow the lawn, which means they precipitate a conflict with the Palestinians. They go in there, they kill hundreds, if not thousands of Palestinians, destroy some buildings, and send them a very clear message that, we're in charge and we want you to understand that you have to remain in this open-air prison. So that's the basic situation that exists. It looks like Netanyahu is managing the situation, and almost everybody thinks that, which is, again, is why they get caught with their pants down on October 7th. But again, what happens on October 7th is that Hamas attacks into Israel, and I think it's fair to say achieves a spectacular success. I think the evidence is that Hamas was surprised by how successful they were. And anyway, they eventually leave Israel. and the Israelis consolidate the situation inside of their borders. And then they eventually go on the offensive against Hamas. And that offensive is now taking place. Okay. Now, what we want to ask ourselves is, what exactly are Israel's goals here? It's very important to understand what Israel is trying to do. Now, if you read the mainstream media in the West, and this includes Australia, what people talk about is that Israel is interested in, number one, defeating Hamas. And here we're talking about decisively defeating Hamas and eliminating Hamas. And you can understand why, from Israel's point of view, that makes sense. The second goal is to get the hostages back. As you all know, Hamas took about 240 hostages. And what the Israelis obviously want to do is get those hostages back. So there's sort of two principal goals here: defeat Hamas decisively and get back the hostages. What's not discussed in the Western media is the real goal. And the real goal is to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And the reason they want to ethnically cleanse Gaza is because, number one, that's the way you get out of apartheid. You all understand. Israel is an apartheid state. And the only way you get out of that situation is you cleanse. Furthermore, it's the only way you defeat Hamas. I'll talk more about this. It's quite clear that the Israelis are not going to defeat Hamas, right? And I can't believe they thought they would defeat Hamas before they went in there. They're too smart for that. But if you cleanse Gaza and you drive all the Palestinians out, you drive Hamas out. So you solve two of the principal problems you face with ethnic cleansing. You solve the apartheid problem, and you solve the Hamas problem. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, Israel wouldn't do anything like this. Just a couple points. First of all, to create the state of Israel, to begin with, you had to do massive ethnic cleansing. In 1948 and in 1967, the Israelis cleansed huge portions of what is today Greater Israel. And the idea that they wouldn't do this, if you read all sorts of Israeli media, they talk about ethnic cleansing all the time. And it makes perfect sense if you think about it. Final point I'd make to you is, one of the criticisms, and I'll talk more about this, of what the Israelis, and especially Benjamin Netanyahu, are doing in Gaza is they have not come up with a plan for what Gaza is going to look like after the shooting stops. In other words, what's the political solution here once the shooting stops? And Israeli military commanders, IDF military commanders, are constantly complaining these days that Netanyahu doesn't give them any sense of what the final political settlement's going to look like, so they can deal with Hamas and deal with the Palestinians with some thought in mind about what the end game is here. The reason there's no end game, the reason they're not talking about how they're going to administer a Palestinian-dominated Gaza is because they want the Palestinians out. They want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And then that brings us to the question, how do you do this, right? How do you get the Palestinians out? Well, first of all, they definitely went after Hamas to start with. That was the purely military side of the story. They went after Hamas. But to make ethnic cleansing work, you have to, number one, kill significant numbers of people, of Palestinians who are basically innocent Palestinians, not Hamas. You have to kill large numbers of them, and you have to give them a powerful incentive by killing them to drive them out. Number two, you have to make the place unlivable. And that's what they're doing. I mean, they're not just killing people. They're making Gaza unlivable. I could go through this in detail in the Q&A if people want to hear the story. But it is, as many people say, especially the UN people who are there, the place is unlivable. And the reason it's unlivable is because they're trying to cleanse Gaza. It's very important to understand that. And then finally, what they're doing is starving the population. There's all sorts of talk about famine in the northern part of Gaza. The United States is leaning heavily on the Israelis to let food and other kinds of aid in. The Israelis are resisting at every turn. Why are they starving the Palestinians? Why are they killing the Palestinians? Why are they making Gaza unlivable? It's very simple. They want to drive them out. So that's basically what's been happening. And in the beginning, right, there was all sorts of talk about genocide. And I was on the record publicly as saying this is not a genocide. But after December, I changed my mind on that. I think the Israelis are now engaged in genocide. And what's happened here is because they have been unable to get the Palestinians out, they've had to increase the amount of killing that they do, right? They're continuing to push to get the Palestinians out of Gaza. And the way they do that is just kill more and more people and make make the situation in Gaza more and more unlivable, right? So the situation is just getting worse and worse and worse, despite the fact that the United States and actually the West more generally are doing what they can to help feed the Palestinians. So the question is, where are we today? Where are we today? First of all, they've not defeated Hamas. And they're not going to defeat Hamas. Kurt Campbell, who is the Deputy Secretary of State, basically said that yesterday. There are all sorts of stories in the Israeli press that they're not going to defeat Hamas. They haven't gotten the hostages back. And they have not been able to cleanse Gaza. They've not been able to cleanse Gaza. Furthermore, they're stuck in Gaza. They're there, right? They got out in 2005, and they're back there. This is not good. So what you see here is that Israel is in real trouble in Gaza. Now, in addition to the problem in Gaza, they have a huge problem with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah in the north, in support of Hamas, has been shelling northern Israel. And there are somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 Israelis from the northern part of Israel who have had to move into the center of Israel on a temporary basis and can't go home because Hezbollah is shelling northern Israel. And Hezbollah has said that until this all ends in Gaza, they're going to continue to fight the Israelis. This is a huge problem for the Israelis. So they not only have trouble with Hamas in Gaza, they have trouble with Hezbollah up on the northern border. And by the way, the Houthis are actually now taking aim at the Israelis, and the Houthis just recently landed their first missile inside of Israel. Just one, but that's a harbinger of things to come. So you see how much trouble Israel is in. They have not achieved their objectives with regard to those two stated objectives and with regard to the ethnic cleansing. And as I said to you before, you always want to understand there are four options here. First two are off the table, and that comes down to apartheid or ethnic cleansing. And the Israelis understand full well an apartheid state. We remember what happened to South Africa. We have got to solve that problem. That's why ethnic cleansing is so attractive, but they've been unable to ethnically cleanse so far. That's that story. That's the story about Gaza. Let's shift gears now and talk about Iran versus Israel versus the United States. Up until April 1st, the war between Israel and Iran, and even the United States and Iran, was a shadow war. And it's very important to understand that we did not want the war, that shadow war, to escalate. We did not want to see Iran and Israel get into a fight. Very important to understand, nor did the Iranians. The Iranians had no interest in escalation. The country that had an interest in escalation were the Israelis. The Israelis have had their gun sights on Iran for a long time, and they've been doing everything they can over time to pull us into a war against Iran. But we didn't want a war. What happens on April 1st, as I'm sure all of you remember, is that the Israelis hit the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. This drives the Iranians up a tree. And the Iranians make it clear that they're going to retaliate against Israel. The United States is aghast. The United States is very angry at the Israelis for doing this and not telling them that it was coming. So the Israelis, right, look like they're going to get a big conflict between Israel and the United States on one side and the Iranians on the other side. But the United States doesn't want this, and Iran doesn't want this. So what happens? This is April 1st, the attack on the embassy. On April 14th, Iran retaliates against Israel. You all remember this. The question is, what happens between April 1st and April 14th? And then what happens on April 14th? It's all very important to understand these details. The United States and Iran work together through intermediaries, because we don't have direct relations. We work together through intermediaries to make sure that the Iranian attack is limited, that we see it coming beforehand, and that the United States and the Israelis and others are able to deal with the attack. Furthermore, we make it clear that we want the Iranians not to hit any populated areas and to basically go after one or two military targets. We and the Iranians agree that it will be a limited attack. We're coordinating with the Iranians because, again, we don't want escalation. We, meaning the Americans, nor do they. Then, when the Iranian attack comes, a hotline, an informal hotline is set up between the United States and Iran via Oman, because both the Iranians and the Americans want to keep this one under control. Very important to understand that. And the Iranians attack, and what happens there? The Americans are deeply involved in defending Israel. You all remember, everybody talked about how the Jordanians, the Saudis, the French, the British, the Americans, the Israelis, they were all involved in dealing with this attack. This is a real problem for Israel, because Israel has always prided itself on being able to independently deal with an adversary that thinks about attacking it. Well, in this case, right, not only are we coordinating things with the Iranians to make sure this is limited and it doesn't spin out of control, but there is considerable evidence that roughly half of the missiles and drones that were shot down by the United States, not by Israel. Roughly half. We were deeply involved. We had naval ships that shot down Iranian ballistic missiles, and we were using fighter aircraft to shoot down cruise missiles and shoot down drones. Now, the Israelis played a very important role in this, but it's important to understand we, the United States of America, were coordinating the effort. See how deeply involved we were? We wanted to keep this one under control. We wanted to make sure that that Iranian offensive against Israel was not successful. That brings me to the final part of the story about April events involving Iran and Israel. The Israelis retaliate on April 19th. Remember, April 1st is when they hit the embassy in Damascus. April 14th is when Iran goes after Israel, does limited damage and hardly any damage. And then on April 19th, the Israelis retaliate. Now, as you would expect, the Israelis wanted to unleash the dogs. The Israelis wanted a big counterattack on Iran. The United States did not want that for 1 second. We were trying to put a cap on the volcano. So what the Israelis end up doing is basically taking out one radar in the Isfahan area of Iran. Just one radar. It's a radar associated with an S-300 missile. It is a very, very limited response. And it's a limited response because the United States demands that it be a limited response. Furthermore, we go to great lengths to tell the Israelis they actually won a great victory on April 14th by stopping all those Israeli missiles and drones. So Israel, accept the fact that you won a great victory on April 14th. All we need is just a small-scale attack where we go after one radar, and that's the end of the story. And of course, that was the end of the story. This one went away, unlike Gaza, which continues on to this day. So what I'm telling you is you have these two big conflicts, the one in Gaza, which I just described, and then the one involving Iran, Israel, and the United States between April 1st and April 19th. Now, I want to talk about the consequences of this for Israel, United States, and for Iran. And as I said to you, I believe that Israel was the big loser here. Now you're saying to yourself, why is that the case? Number of reasons. First of all, the Israelis are back in Gaza. They got out in 2005. Ariel Sharon, as you all know, is no shrinking violet. He's at least as tough an hombre as Benjamin Netanyahu. He pulled out because Gaza's a hornet's nest. Well, the Israelis are back in Gaza. They have no way of getting out at the moment, and they have no solution to the problem. They've made Gaza unlivable. What are they going to do? The Palestinians are not leaving. What are they going to do? They're running the place. They're in deep trouble. Second reason the Israelis lose, you have to understand how the Israelis think about deterrence. And this is a very smart way of thinking about deterrence. I'm not being critical of Israeli thinking here. What the Israelis believe is that their deterrence depends on escalation dominance. Escalation dominance. That means if somebody whacks me and I whack them back, I whack them back harder than they initially whacked me. In other words, as we go up the escalation ladder, I dominate. Escalation dominance. The best example of this is in the summer of 2003, Hezbollah killed a few Israelis. This is up on the northern border. Hezbollah killed a few Israelis and kidnapped an Israeli. Okay? The Israelis massively retaliated. And Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah, said, I think 2 months later, Nasrallah said, if I had known what the Israelis were going to do in terms of retaliating, I would have never allowed the attack on July 12th, 2006. That's escalation dominance. Do you understand? It's very important. From Israel's point of view, they have to make it clear to all their neighbors that if you whack us, we'll whack you back harder. It's now very clear the Israelis no longer have escalation dominance vis-a-vis Iran or vis-a-vis Hezbollah. They cannot shut down the conflict with Hezbollah on their northern border. It's really quite remarkable. The Israelis are hitting Hezbollah very hard, and Hezbollah is responding. Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and missiles, and those numbers will only grow with the passage of time. 150,000. right? So the Israelis are limited in what they can do. And with regard to Iran, I described to you what happened April 1st, April 14th, April 19th. That is not escalation dominance. I'm sorry. That is not escalation dominance. And furthermore, they needed the Americans. You all understand. I'm just sort of diverting from the path I'm on for 1 second. If you look at what's happening in Gaza, the Israelis could never conduct that operation in Gaza without American support. Not even close. And all sorts of Israeli generals say that in the Israeli press. They cannot, by themselves, produce the weaponry to conduct the operations they're now conducting in Gaza. They need us. And what I'm telling you about what happened on April 14th is they needed us. You hear all this talk about Iron Dome and their ability to shoot down missiles. They cannot do it alone. Iron Dome is not that formidable defensive system. And furthermore, given cost exchange ratios, the number of missiles that the Iranians and Hezbollah have, Iron Dome over the long term in a fight is just not very useful. So from a deterrence point of view, the Israelis are in real trouble. So my first point is they're in real trouble because they're stuck in Gaza and they have no solution to the problem. And number two, their deterrence has been badly weakened. Number three is it's very important to understand with the coming of all these missiles and the coming of drones, it's now possible for actors like Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah, and Iran to develop the capability to hit Israel and cause enormous amounts of damage. And lots of people who live in Israel are not very comfortable with this situation, right? The idea that they are exposed to adversaries, and these are formidable adversaries. I don't want to make light of the fact that groups like Hezbollah and groups like Hamas would like to finish Israel off. They would. No, these are really tough hombres. And what's happened here is that with the passage of time, right, missile capabilities and drone capabilities have reached the point where it's quite easy for actors like that to employ those weapons to create a real threat for Israel. The fourth way in which Israel is in trouble is that it has effectively become a pariah state in ways that it never was in the past. If you look at what's happening in the United States and all across the world on university campuses and college campuses, this is just evidence, whether you think what's going on is right or wrong, that Israel's reputation has been badly tarnished. Just if you think about the fact that South Africa took Israel before the International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice found not that Israel is committing genocide. They didn't find that. That is yet to be determined. But what the International Court of Justice did find is that there is sufficient evidence, there's enough evidence to think that Israel might be committing genocide. And if you look at polls inside the United States, it's truly remarkable how many people, especially Democrats, believed that Israel is engaged in genocide. There's a recent poll that shows that 56% of all Democrats think that Israel is committing genocide. Think about that. 56% of Americans polled think that Israel is committing genocide. There's another poll that talks about Biden voters, that shows that 57% think Israel is committing genocide. 27% are not sure. 57% think Israel is committing genocide. 27% are not sure. And then 15% do not believe Israel is committing genocide. This is quite remarkable. When I think about how I thought about Israel, and virtually everybody I knew thought about Israel when I was a young boy and I was a young man, and how virtually everybody I know now thinks about Israel, a fundamental transformation has taken place. It's really quite remarkable. And the idea that the Jewish state is being accused of genocide is really quite remarkable. This is a sign of big trouble. And the use of the apartheid label is used increasingly. And this is not going to change because the situation in Gaza is not going to get any better. That was one of the points I'm trying to get through to you. There is no solution on the horizon here. If anybody asked me in the question and answer period, what would I do to fix this problem? I could tell you what the answer is now. I have no idea. Let's be very clear on this. Categorically depressing. But anyway, I think that from Israel's point of view, what's happened to its reputation is disastrous. And I don't think it's going to get any better over time. So this is why these four reasons. Number one, the fact they're stuck in Gaza once more. Number two, the fact that their deterrence has been weakened because they don't have escalation dominance. Number three, the fact that they're surrounded by adversaries who loathe them, would like to destroy them, and who have increasing numbers of missiles and drones that can cause them lots of trouble is bad news. And number four, the pariah state argument. Now let me conclude by talking briefly about the United States and talking about Iran. The United States is also a big loser here. First of all, it's in our interest to have peace in the Middle East. First of all, we've been fighting so many wars. The American public is just sick of all these wars. The last thing we want are more wars in the Middle East. Oh my God, a war against Iran. This is the last thing people want, right? We want peace. Furthermore, we need a peaceful Middle East so we can pivot to East Asia, right? From an American point of view, the most serious threat on the planet is China. The United States has to contain China. We have to pivot to Asia. We can't pivot to Asia because we're pinned down in Ukraine, and now we're pinned down in the Middle East. This is not good. We want, for sure, to settle this one, right? To have a situation like the one that existed before October 7th. Remember, Jake Sullivan said a few weeks before October 7th, we haven't seen the Middle East this peaceful for a long time, and he was very happy about that. And it made perfect sense from an American point of view. But that went away very quickly on October 7th. So we want peace. Second point is, we also care greatly about having friendly relations with as many states in the Middle East as possible. Why is that the case? The Russians are already there, number one, and two, the Chinese are beginning to move in. For all the older dogs, I noticed there are a number of older dogs in the audience. We all remember back in the day, right, when the US and the Soviet Union competed in the Middle East. Well, what you're going to see moving forward is not just the United States and Russia, but the United States, Russia, and China competing in the Middle East. The Chinese are building a blue water navy to project power into the Gulf, number one. Number two, they depend heavily on oil. Therefore, they're doing everything they can to have good relations with Iran, good relations with Saudi Arabia. And we are very worried about this. The United States doesn't want bad relations with countries in the Middle East that drive them into the arms of the Chinese and the Russians. And you see a lot of that happening. By the way, you all know about the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords was where the United States was recently trying to get Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States all together in a sort of quasi-alliance. This is all gone by the boards now because of what's happening in Gaza, right? This is not in our interest. It's certainly not in Israel's interest, and it's certainly not in Saudi's interest at all either. So you see the problem that we have here. There's one other problem, and this applies to the Israelis as well, is the nuclear issue. You all understand Iran is a hop, skip, and a jump away from developing nuclear weapons because we, with pressure from the Israelis, we, the Americans, pulled out of the JCPOA. That was the nuclear agreement that the Obama administration crafted with Iran, the Iranians are now enriching uranium up to 60%. And you have to enrich uranium up to 90% to have enough, to have it capable of being turned into a bomb. And it's very easy to get from 60% to 90%. My guess is, and just from reading the literature, that Iran could have enough fissile material for 3 bombs in about 6 weeks. That's not a bomb, that's just the fissile material. I think it would take probably about 6 months to build 3 bombs, and then they'd have to develop the delivery capability. So it's not like they're going to develop a bomb in a month or two's time. That's not going to happen, but they're not that far away. And what happens when you bomb their embassy and then you get in a tit-for-tat fight with them on April 14th and April 19th is you give them an incentive to get nuclear weapons. And you can see signs of that. You can see signs of the Iranians talking about getting nuclear weapons. So one of the principal problems that the Israelis and the Americans face as a result of what happened between April 1st and April 19th is we've incentivized the Iranians to get nuclear weapons. Not that they'll go through with it, but we've given them powerful incentive to do that. And they have the capability because they can enrich uranium up to 90% and then produce bombs. Just say a few words in conclusion, Tom, about Iran. As I said to you before, I think Iran is the winner. I think America's the loser. I think Israel is the biggest loser. But I think that the Iranians are the winners so far. And this is not to say that they have really come out of this smelling like a rose, as my mother used to say. I don't want to go that far. But on balance, I think they've done quite well for themselves. First of all, they have been able, except for April 14th, to remain on the sidelines. And they are using their proxies in the region, or they're working with their proxies, that's a better way to put it, to great effect. Because as you know, the Iranians are allied with Hamas, they're allied with Hezbollah, they're allied with the Houthis, and they're allied with these militias inside of Iraq and Syria that have their gun sights not only on the United States, but on Israel as well. So they have been able to stay out of the fight, yet see their proxies do very well in this conflict with both the United States and Israel. Another point that you want to keep in mind is that Iran, as a result of all this, now has very close relations with Russia and China. What we're doing, what the United States is doing, is we're driving the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, and the North Koreans together, right? And this makes it harder for us to isolate Iran. And if Iran starts to go down the nuclear weapons road, and we want to put pressure on the Iranians, it's not clear the Chinese and the Russians are going to help us very much. We need the Chinese and the Russians to help us. But anyway, the Iranians feel like they're in quite a good situation because the United States and the Israelis have not been able to do anything to really harm them. In fact, Iran got away with whacking Israel. This is the first time that Iran has ever been able to launch missiles and drones from its own territory, hit Israel, and Israel barely retaliated. The Iranians are probably feeling good about that, as they should. And then the final point is the sanctions against Iran are not working the way they once were. They have weakened. So if you look overall at what's happened to the Iranians and what's happening to the Americans, and especially what's happening to the Israelis, you see that the situation after October 7th is fundamentally different than the situation before October 7th. Just in the case of the Israelis, before October 7th, it looked like they were in the catbird seat. They were managing very well in their own opinion, the situation in Gaza. And by the way, I want to be clear here. I thought they were doing an excellent job of managing the problem in Gaza. I thought they had things under control. I was shocked by what happened on October 7th. But once October 7th happened, and as we've watched these two conflicts play themselves out, one, the war in Gaza and how that's linked to Hezbollah, you don't want to forget, and then two, the Iran, Israel, United States exchange between April 1st and April 19th, it's quite clear that the world has changed in ways that are not good for either Israel or the United States. Thank you.